So deeper learning is when students have what we call deep retained knowledge. It's where they've actually internalized something that they've learned. And that's the most important part. So whether that's achieved through a student-driven kind of activity or a real-world challenge, any of those ways that you personalize it for the student, the deeper learning comes from their application of what they're learning, their reflection on what they're learning, and their ability to communicate what they learned. So when a student is giving that final presentation, or they're in the process and they're talking about their work, you can see it in them, you can see the joy in their face about it. They're excited and they are confident. And the confidence comes from the fact that they really get it. They've actually worked this through themselves, and they've taken the content and they've applied it and they've thought about it and they've got their own ideas about it, and they're confident. That comes out in their communication. And so that's the key thing to me that's how I know when they've done it, that they can talk about it with great confidence. The work has to be relevant to students. Without relevancy, they're not interested, they're not going to follow up, they're not going to finish. And so you have to, when you're designing learning experiences, you need to figure out, where is the student in this? Are they actually deciding what they're learning? Are you telling what they're learning and then asking them to apply it to their life? Where in their life does this show up? Right? And that's really important. That helps the student really engage with the material, because they can suddenly see themselves. And that's why it's so important that you have, mirrors on your bookshelves. Your books in your classroom have to have the images and the people that the student lives with, okay? And that the student wants to see himself in.
As a social studies teacher, I learned that it was my responsibility to help students figure out why something was important. I used to think a lot about the content of what I was teaching. It is totally possible to impact the world, be uber rich, cure cancer, be Mother Teresa, go to Mars without remembering the popes in chronological order, the states in alphabetical order, or most of the facts that I was teaching about in world history. It was my job as a world history teacher to help students understand why the ancient Greeks were important. What lessons could we learn from the ancient Greeks? Because certainly knowing about the ancient Greeks alone wasn't enough.
I think it's important that students have a voice in what they're learning. That's essential. And you have to have processes for them to do those stages I'm talking about. When you introduce a new topic, you're suggesting to them, here's what I want you to learn, or here's where I want you to start to learn. And whether the student is going off on a student-driven learning kind of thing, or whether they're following your plan, they know what the end result is. And so then they're working toward that, and you're always going back and saying, where are you towards the goal? How are you doing with it? There's always a chance where they're getting new information. There's always a time when they're reviewing it and reflecting on it and applying it, and talking about the defensive learning at the end, or however you want to call it, the presentation of learning, where they actually get to talk about it. That's where the deep learning is really obvious.
Every unit's different, right? The product of what kids are going to do to demonstrate learning looks different. They might be building something if they're studying shelters. They might be writing something if they're studying communication. But I think the critical component in a progressive setting is, yes, the product that evolves from the students and teachers working together throughout the unit, but then the student being able to describe their learning and reflect on that product is really the critical piece. And I think that's a hallmark of progressive education, that I'm able to talk about the process that I use to create this product. And that reflection and that reflective piece is a lot of what teachers use to gauge student growth, not how well the product turned out, but the student's ability to articulate the learning process. When students are asked to reflect and describe the process that they went through to learn and what the outcomes were, this might look like a written format for older children, or being able to articulate to their teacher and reflect through an interview or dialogue, or even a group dialogue, and then the teacher keeps a record of everything that was said, and then that becomes evidence of the process.
If you don't cycle back through the reflection piece, you're never going to actually internalize it. So when I do a lesson, I often have like a goal on the board, and we go back to that all the time. Where do you think we are here now in this goal? Where do you think this is going to go next? Where should we go after? How does this relate to yesterday? And so they're constantly connecting the pieces, and that's what's important about the reflection. They're always connecting it to their own experience, to the outside world, to their classroom, to everywhere. And then it's not just a question or a piece of information, it actually belongs to the world that they live in. So assessing deeper learning has a lot of different components in it. There's not just one way to assess it. Something like an authentic assessment is really valuable. Okay? That's where the student is talking to a real world audience, not just the teacher, not just their classmates. They're talking about what they've learned to someone else, and that can happen in many different ways. Student-led conferences, progress conferences, discussion-based assessments. There's all sorts of ways that a student talks about their learning. So that's one component, like the authentic assessment, where they are either working with a real project or a real person. That's also another way to do it. You always have to have the different competencies. So, for example, deep retained knowledge is essential. You have to be able to talk about it with the vocabulary of the course and show how you apply it. And those are all things that you're looking, when you're building a rubric for a project like that, you need to make sure that you have more than just one facet of assessment. And the assessment should happen all through the experience. It's not just a summative thing. You don't just at the end of the project go tick, 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 A+. It doesn't work that way. Okay? So there's all the different things that you're assessing.
When we put too much pressure on one form of assessment to capture all of the learning, we tend to Frankenstein that assessment, and the assessment becomes either invalid or too unwieldy. We're not able to actually see the learning that's happened because we've designed something too big, or we put too many parts on it to actually have that assessment be functional. So the first key is allowing for multiple forms of assessment. And in fact, I would say in most classrooms, having a mix of some more traditional or smaller forms of assessment is fine. When I work with teachers, I encourage them to keep the quiz or the post-it note exit ticket on the way out. Those are really good ways to figure out if a student has that small content piece that needs to be applied for them to be able to be successful in the project-based learning that's coming up. One of the things that I found most successful is if we're going to keep some of these more traditional assessments, which I encourage us to do, is to have those not be the final assessment piece. If, for example, we're going to keep a final exam of sorts, because maybe our school requires it, or maybe it's important for me as a teacher to understand what content knowledge a kid has, that final exam doesn't need to be final. It could be a summative assessment that's done 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the unit, so that I, as a teacher, understand the content knowledge a kid has, because content knowledge is important. Those are the Lego building blocks that allow a kid to make that metaphorical Death Star out of the Lego.
The big idea around assessment is that we're looking for growth over time, and we want to have multiple ways to gather that sort of information. And so that's quite different from coming from like a standards-based perspective, or like a cut score, or they need to be reading by this particular age, but that we want to see growth over time. One way that we do this is just from formative assessments in the classroom where they're working on activities. A lot of it, though, is relying on teacher observation and keeping running records of students, and then being able to put portfolios together of their learning. And then teachers and students work together to distill that information and communicate that to parents through the three-way conference. And then students also receive a report card where the teacher is able to take words from the students, put them together, and also assess students on scales related more to like specific academic skills. But in addition to that, there's opportunities for concerts and gallery shows and performances. And so really looking at this whole panorama of the way in which we can see kids as individuals, and we use all of that as data to communicate outward. You're looking at a broad range of competencies. One is the knowledge, and that's where
most of the standardized testing comes from what do they know. But we're not looking just at that. That's definitely one part of it. Deep retained knowledge is essential. But you want to look at some of those what we call 21st century skills, the softer skills like collaboration, cooperation, the ability to communicate, the ability to do presentations, to think critically. All of those things are part of it. And so your assessment has to have kind of a wide spectrum of what you're looking for and what students are demonstrating. That's the stuff that traditional teachers are used to doing. They said, did you fill out the log? Tick, tick, tick. And that is definitely part of it too, is the student meeting the deadlines. And it really helps if you negotiate the deadlines with the student. If they are driving some of those choices, and then when they're not meeting those choices, it's on them, and they understand that more clearly. So the responsibility that comes in, the collaboration pieces, the go out and finish this on a timeline, all of these things are parts of the assessment.
I oftentimes hear specifically elementary school teachers talk about needing to wait for deeper learning until what? Until students have learned to read, until they've learned to write, until they've learned basic mathematics, and these foundational skills are not deeper learning in one definition. They're building blocks that are a prerequisite to doing something with learning. And I would say that that's not entirely true. One of my educational mentors, Bob Peters, is a longtime early childhood and elementary school leader. And one of the things he's always pushed on me is that you don't have to wait for a student to learn how to read or learn how to write for them to do something meaningful. That there's a lot of meaning and a lot of impact and purpose can and should be had without reading and writing and arithmetic. If we construct learning in a way that is deep in meaning and purpose and has an impact, that learning context can be one through which we learn to read, we practice our writing, and we gain a sense of arithmetic. There's always context to learning. Either we purposefully design as educators the context for the math that we think is important right now, or the context is gleaned incidentally. The context might be math sucks. At its smallest step, deeper learning happens when we plan for learning that has context, purpose, and impact. So let's just imagine that we're in a pretty highly controlled traditional classroom, and I'm a teacher in that classroom, and I'm accountable to people outside of my classroom who are requiring me to do things that might not look like deeper learning. If my job and I'm accountable to a system that requires me to teach chapter 2 of this math textbook, for example, it is possible for us to take these small steps so that even in these more traditional units and lessons, we can reach a deeper learning. I would frame that as context, purpose, and impact. Whatever the lesson or unit is, if we can bring some sort of real context to that, if we can frame that unit or seat that unit in the real world and in a world that truly is relatable to the learner. Secondly, it's important that students see the purpose of what they're learning. Without that, it's just a fact that rattles around in their brain and eventually falls out of their brain. When we can help students connect the dots between what they're learning and how they're going to eventually use it, hopefully actually use it now, that's moving towards deeper learning. And third would be impact. If what we do leads to some sort of real world impact, an impact that goes beyond the four walls of the classroom, that goes beyond the peers and the teacher, if there's a result of the learning that's more meaningful than the grade between the student and the teacher, then we're getting to deeper learning.
If you look at the Common Core and you look at the C3 framework for social studies state standards or in the next generation science standards, they're really actually aiming for this particular type of learning. They want higher order thinking skills, they want students to be able to use evidence to support their claims. And so I think that this actually mirrors what high level, high stakes, exams want to do, but it's using a different format to gather the evidence to show that they've met these particular learning standards. And I think that's the difference, is that we have this old model of tests to be able to measure these new things, and I say in quotes, new things that we want schools to be doing, which we have the wrong format for gathering information about kids. And so I think when you use something like a student-led conference or having kids reflect on their learning afterwards, that's a better tool for educators to gather the information that they need to show that they've achieved these standards that we have in our country right now.
When the student is learning in a deep experience, when they're actually processing it through their own eyes in their own world, it sticks with them. And when they've talked about it, they've taught it to somebody, they've communicated it to an expert, or any way that they do that reflection piece and the communication piece, it's in them forever. The results are clear in all of the studies that to retain the knowledge, you have to live it and be it and internalize it.